December 14th, 1944. Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. 06:42 p.m. The doors opened without shouting. That was the first thing she noticed. No boots slamming the floor. No barked orders. No rifle stocks striking wood to hurry them along. Just a simple motion of a hand from an American guard and the low scrape of chairs being pushed back inside the building ahead. She stepped forward with the others, her coat still damp from the cold evening air. Her fingers numb her stomach hollow in a way that had become familiar over the past 2 years. The sign above the doorway read, "Mess Hall." In plain block letters, white paint slightly chipped at the edges. She had prepared herself for this moment. She had imagined it dozens of times during the Atlantic crossing, during the train rides through endless American countryside, during the long nights in the barracks when fear was easier than sleep. A prison meal, watery soup, thin bread. Something gray and portioned precisely enough to remind you that survival was permitted, comfort was not. She crossed the threshold, and immediately something felt wrong. The floor beneath her boots was wood, clean wood, scrubbed smooth and worn shiny in places where countless feet had passed before. Overhead, electric lights burned steadily, not flickering, not dimmed, casting a warm, even glow across the room. The air was thick with a smell she had not encountered in months. Hot meat and coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter burnt substitutes she remembered from Germany. This smell was round and dark and unmistakable, curling through the air like something alive. She slowed without meaning to. So did the women around her. For a brief moment, the line of German prisoners stalled, not because anyone told them to stop, but because their bodies refused to move forward at the same pace their minds demanded. This did not look like a prison. Long tables filled the room, polished smooth by years of use. Benches ran along either side, pushed neatly underneath. At the far end, steam rose in slow, steady clouds from metal-serving trays. A man in an apron moved behind the counter sleeves, rolled up his movements, unhurried, almost casual. No one was counting. No one was measuring. No one was shouting numbers in clipped, angry syllables. Her instincts told her to tighten, to pull inward, to prepare for disappointment or cruelty disguised as order. Instead, she felt something else creeping in. Something far more dangerous. Confusion. She took her tray when it was handed to her. It was heavier than she expected, thick metal that did not bend under her fingers. She carried it to the serving line, every sense alert, waiting for the moment when the illusion would collapse. It did not. A portion of meat landed on her plate with a soft, solid weight. Mashed potatoes followed pale and steaming, then bread-white bread placed without ceremony at the side. The smell made her throat tighten. She walked to the table and sat. Only then did she notice the details. The spoon resting beside her plate was heavy, not stamped thin like emergency-issue cutlery, not warped from overuse. It sat solid in her palm, balanced, made to last. The napkin folded beside it was white, truly. White thick enough to absorb grease without tearing. This was not temporary. This was not improvised. This was how Americans ate. She stared at the bread. In Germany, in 1944, bread had become a negotiation. Dark loaves cut thinner each week. Crumbs, saved slices weighed. Butter replaced by margarine, when it could be found at all, and then replaced by nothing. Coffee had vanished long ago, replaced by bitter substitutes that tasted of burnt grain and desperation. Here, the bread was soft. Here, there was butter, real butter. She touched it with the edge of her knife, half expecting it to resist, to betray itself as something false. It yielded smoothly, leaving a pale smear that caught the light. Across the table, one of the women whispered something in German. Another shook her head slowly, as if trying to wake herself from a dream. The Americans moved through the room without urgency. Guards leaned against walls, rifles slung loosely over shoulders, not scanning faces, not watching hands. A woman in uniform passed between tables carrying a stack of napkins, her expression neutral, almost bored. No one was staring at them. No one was enjoying their discomfort. That unsettled her more than open hostility ever could have. She did not eat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Something was wrong. Too much was wrong. She had been taught to expect brutality. She had prepared herself for hunger. She had accepted pain as a constant companion, something predictable and therefore manageable. This abundance had no shape she recognized. Her eyes moved again to the spoon, to the bread, to the steam rising from her plate. The smell pressed against her memories, unlocking images she had sealed away. A kitchen before the war, a table set without counting, a Sunday that did not require justification. Her stomach tightened not with hunger, but with suspicion. Nothing this generous came without a price. She forced herself to lift the spoon, then stopped. Around her, some women had begun to eat cautiously, as if expecting the food to vanish if touched too eagerly. Others stared frozen as she was. She lowered the spoon again. This kindness felt like a trap. She had learned painfully that cruelty announced itself. It shouted, it struck it humiliated openly. Kindness, on the other hand, could disarm. It could make you careless. It could make you hope. And hope, she knew, was the most dangerous thing a prisoner could carry. She looked around the room once more, committing every detail to memory. The clean floor, the steady lights, the quiet clatter of cutlery, the absence of fear in the faces of the people serving her. This was not what prison looked like, and that realization frightened her more than barbed wire ever had. She did not touch the food, not at first. Around her, the mess hall slowly filled with sound, the scrape of benches, the muted clink of cutlery, the careful breathing of women who did not yet trust what sat in front of them. Steam continued to rise from the plates, patient indifferent to suspicion. She waited. If this was a test, she would not fail it by rushing. That had been drilled into her long before capture, long before America. The Reich had taught them many things, but one lesson had been repeated with particular insistence: the enemy never gives without taking something first. She lifted the spoon at last and took a single bite. It was enough. The food was hot all the way through, not warm on the surface and cold in the middle. The meat pulled apart easily, tender in a way she had forgotten food could be. Salt, fat, texture, all present, all unashamed. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to chew slowly, deliberately, as if excess speed might expose her intentions. She swallowed, then took a second bite smaller than the first. She counted them without realizing she was doing it. 3 bites of meat, 2 of potatoes, 1 of bread. Then she stopped. She set the spoon down beside the plate, aligned carefully with the edge of the tray. The portion that remained was nearly half. She stared at it as if it might begin to speak. This was the part that mattered. In Germany, leaving food untouched was unthinkable. At home, plates had been wiped clean with crusts of bread, fingers scraping the last traces of sauce. At the front, men fought over crumbs without shame. Hunger stripped etiquette first, dignity second. Here she left a food behind on purpose. It was not restraint. It was observation. If the Americans were watching, this would tell them something. If they intended to humiliate her later, she would remember this moment, the moment she had not surrendered herself completely. Her eyes flicked up, searching for reaction. There was none. The guards leaned against the walls as before. One laughed quietly at something his companion said. The woman in uniform passed again, collecting empty napkins, her attention already moving past the prisoners as if they were furniture. No one cared. That frightened her more than scrutiny ever could. She slid the plate slightly away from herself and folded her hands in her lap. The smell still clung to her, coating her thoughts, making it harder to maintain the distance she needed. Hunger crept back in slow and insistent, now sharpened by the knowledge of what she was refusing. Across the table, a woman tore her bread in half, ate one piece, then paused. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed between them, but understanding did. This was not about eating. It was about surviving the kindness. She waited until the women beside her stood and carried their trays away before she acted. When the bench shifted and the sound around her rose slightly, she leaned forward, casual, precise, and broke her remaining bread into small pieces. Not chunks. Crumbs. Her fingers moved quickly, practiced. She slipped the pieces into the pocket sewn inside her coat, the one she had reinforced with extra stitching months earlier, without knowing why. Each movement was small, invisible to anyone not looking for it. She felt a familiar burning shame as she did it. This habit was old. It had been born in railway stations and cellars in bombed apartments where the walls breathed dust, in kitchens where mothers cut slices thinner each week and smiled anyway. She had learned to hide food the way others learned to read, early, quietly, with no expectation of praise. Still, doing it here felt different. The food was not being taken from her. It was being offered. That made the hiding worse, not better. She slid the empty plate forward and rose with the others, her coat heavier by only a few ounces, yet weighted with memory. As she returned the tray, the man behind the counter nodded once, barely looking at her face. "Evening," he said, not in German, not through an interpreter, just a word given and gone. She did not answer. Back in the barracks, the women settled into a restless quiet. The air smelled of soap and wool, and the lingering trace of dinner clinging to fabric. Someone lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently. Another sat at the edge of her bed boots, still on hands folded, eyes unfocused. No one spoke about the meal. Speaking would make it real. She reached into her pocket when she was sure no one was watching and touched the crumbs. Her fingers came away greasy. She wiped them carefully on a handkerchief, folding it twice, then again. The habit of saving did not disappear simply because abundance had appeared. Lying back on her bunk, she stared at the wooden slats above her head and thought of Germany. Not the Germany of speeches and banners, but the one that existed at the end of 1944. Women standing in lines that wrapped around blocks, clutching ration cards that promised less each month. Children with hollow cheeks and coats too thin for winter, taught to be grateful for soup that barely warmed them. Kitchens where shelves stood half empty, yet were still scrubbed clean out of stubborn pride. She thought of her mother cutting potatoes, smaller stretching meals with water, pretending not to be hungry herself. Of the careful arithmetic every household learned, how long a loaf must last, how many mouths it had to feed. Hunger had shaped everything. Across the ocean, in this place called America, hunger seemed to be a choice rather than a condition. She had seen it through the train windows on the Journey West fields, stretching farther than the eye could follow, barns heavy with grain towns with lit windows and smoke rising from chimneys in steady, unhurried columns. She had smelled it in the stations and the freight yards, in the strange abundance of goods stacked and waiting rather than guarded and counted. The Americans called them victory gardens. She had overheard small plots behind houses, neat rows of vegetables grown not out of desperation, but participation. Civilians planting food because they could, because it helped, because it was expected. Here, food was not proof of loyalty. It was simply there. That was the most unsettling part. She lay awake longer than usual that night, listening to the sounds of the barracks settling around her. Somewhere a woman turned over and sighed. Another whispered a name into the darkness and then fell silent. She pressed a hand against her pocket again, reassured by the presence of what she had saved. The crumbs were insignificant, barely enough to satisfy a child, yet they anchored her to a reality she understood. Because if there was one thing she knew with certainty, it was this: nothing. This generous came without a price. She just did not know yet what the Americans intended to collect, and that uncertainty tightened around her chest, slow and deliberate, long after the lights were turned off. She expected punishment. Not immediately. Americans, she had learned, did nothing immediately, but eventually. A look, a note, a quiet change in routine that would tell her the test had been failed. Nothing happened. Morning came, then work detail, then noon. And then the bell rang again. The sound carried across the compound in the same unhurried way it had the night before, a dull, metallic note that did not command so much as invite. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest as she joined the line toward the mess hall once more. This was when the price would be named. The room looked the same. Same clean floor, same steady lights, same smell of hot food and coffee, rich and unapologetic. If anything, that unsettled her more. The women took their trays in silence, movements careful, synchronized, without intention. She felt her body preparing itself, muscles tensing for restraint, for calculation. She had already decided how this would go, half again, no more. She sat, waited, watched. The food was different this time. A stew, thick with vegetables. Bread, still warm, the butter soft enough to spread without effort. She ate as she had planned, slowly, deliberately stopping when instinct told her to continue. She left the rest. The room filled and emptied at a measured pace. Trays, scraped benches, shifted. She noticed something odd: the Americans were not rushing them. No one stood behind the last table, arms crossed, watching the clock. The rhythm belonged to the eaters, not the servers. She rose when it seemed appropriate and carried her tray forward. That was when it happened. A voice spoke from behind the counter. Not loud, not commanding, not even particularly interested. "If anyone wants seconds," the man said, wiping his hands on a cloth, "please come back." The words landed softly. Too softly. For a moment she wondered if she had misheard. English still moved strangely in her ears, familiar but unreliable. She watched the faces around her for confirmation. No one moved. The line halted, as if a rope had been pulled tight around it. Trays hovered in midair. A woman at the front glanced back, her expression sharp with suspicion. Someone behind her shifted, then froze again. Seconds. The word echoed in her mind with no meaning attached. In Germany, seconds did not exist. There was first and there was nothing. There was your portion and someone else's need. To ask for more was to declare yourself selfish or desperate or both. Here it was being offered. She felt her heartbeat quicken. This had to be the trick. If anyone wanted seconds, it sounded too casual, too careless, a phrase meant to expose weakness, to identify those who could be broken with a little comfort, a little indulgence. She tightened her grip on the tray. No one stepped forward. The man behind the counter waited. He did not repeat himself. He did not look up to scan faces. He adjusted a serving spoon, checked something behind him, patient as a man waiting for rain. Time stretched. She could hear the hum of the lights, the soft clatter of utensils being stacked. Somewhere a guard cleared his throat. Still, no one moved. Her thoughts raced, colliding with one another. If you go, they will remember. If you stay, you prove discipline. If you go, you show hunger. If you stay, you survive. Her stomach tightened painfully, reminding her that it had opinions of its own. Then, from the far side of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound was small, almost accidental. A woman stood. She was younger than most, thin in the way people became thin when hunger had shaped them for too long. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, eyes flicking toward the guards, then toward the counter. No one stopped her. She walked forward, her steps measured, cautious. The room held its breath. The man behind the counter did not ask her name. He did not ask for her ration card. He did not signal to anyone. He took her tray and ladled stew onto it, not carefully measured, not weighed, but the way one filled a bowl at home with a practiced wrist and an eye for balance. He added another piece of bread, pressed it into place, then slid the tray back toward her. "That good?" he asked, not unkindly. The woman nodded, unable to speak. She returned to her table. No alarms sounded. No guards moved. No one wrote anything down. The room exhaled. Something loosened in she's chest, just enough to hurt. If this was a trap, it was a strange one. Too inefficient. Too unceremonious. No humiliation, no moment of dominance. Just food given again without comment. A second woman stood. Then another. Each time the same ritual repeated, the spoon dipped to the tray filled the transaction completed without spectacle. The Americans did not smile. They did not watch reactions. They did not announce generosity. They simply fed people who asked. She remained seated. Her tray sat in front of her half full exactly as she had left it. Her fingers curled against the edge knuckles, pale. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to stay where she was, to observe, to learn. But another voice had begun to speak, quieter, more dangerous. What if there is no price? The question frightened her more than the idea of punishment ever could have. She stood before she realized she had decided. The movement felt foreign, like stepping into cold water. She carried her tray forward, aware of eyes on her now, not hostile, not judgmental, simply curious. She stopped a few steps from the counter and hesitated. The man looked up. "Yes," he said. The word was neutral, open. She searched for the correct phrase, the one that would not expose her too much. Her mouth felt dry. Is it allowed?" she asked. The man blinked once, surprised, then shrugged slightly. "Sure," he said. "That's what it's for." That was all. He took the tray and filled it again, the spoon, moving with the same unthinking ease as before. The portion was generous without being excessive, as if the concept of excess did not apply. He handed it back. She stared at the plate. For a moment, she could not move. No one had raised their voice. No one had corrected her. No one had demanded gratitude. She returned to her seat, slowly aware of the room in a way she had not been before. The sound of chewing seemed louder, now more confident. Someone laughed softly at something unrelated. Life continued unremarkable. She lifted the spoon. Her hand shook. Not with hunger, she had learned to control that, but with something else, something unfamiliar. The realization pressed against her ribs until it became difficult to breathe. They were not keeping score. This was not an exchange. This was not a demonstration. This was simply what happened when food ran out and people were still hungry. She lowered the spoon again and stared at the steam rising from her plate, watching it disappear into the air without effort or struggle. For the first time since capture, she felt the sharp edge of certainty begin to dull. Not vanish, but crack. If this was cruelty, it wore no mask she recognized, and that frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. It was not the food that broke her. It was the silence after it. The room had returned to its rhythm, spoons rising and falling, benches shifting, a quiet confidence settling into the space as if it had always belonged there. The moment had passed for everyone else. Seconds had become simply part of the meal, folded into routine without ceremony. For her, time had slowed. She sat with the plate in front of her fuller than before, steam lifting in thin, wavering lines. The smell no longer startled her. It pressed closer now, intimate, undeniable. She lifted the spoon. Her hand shook, not violently. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough that she noticed it, just enough that it surprised her. She adjusted her grip, tightened her fingers, tried again. The spoon rattled softly against the plate. She froze. Her breathing had changed. She became aware of it suddenly shallow and uneven, as if her body had forgotten the rhythm it was meant to follow. She lowered the spoon and stared at her hands instead. They were steady hands. They had learned to be steady. They had learned to carry heavy things, to sort papers in chaos, to write reports while bombs fell close enough to shake windows loose from their frames. They had learned discipline. They had not learned how to receive. Around her, the women ate. One tore bread without thinking. Another leaned back satisfied and spoke quietly to the woman beside her about the work detail scheduled for the afternoon. Life moved on as it always did. She remained still. The thought came without warning, sharp and intrusive. They didn't punish me. It settled into her chest and stayed there. No reprimand, no raised voice, no mark made beside her name. She had asked, not boldly, not with entitlement, but she had asked, and the world had not collapsed. No one had taken anything from her in return. Her throat tightened. She tried to swallow and failed. The room blurred slightly, edges softening, as if someone had breathed against glass. She blinked once hard, then again. Moisture gathered uninvited, stinging her eyes. She turned her head slightly, hoping no one would notice. Her vision failed her anyway. A single tear slipped free, tracing a hot, unfamiliar path down her cheek. She wiped it quickly with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the speed of it, by how little effort it had taken. Another followed. Her shoulders tensed, then lifted in a small, involuntary motion. She pressed her lips together, fighting the sound rising in her throat, a thin, broken breath that did not belong in this room. This was wrong. This was weakness. She had survived worse without crying. She had stood in ruins and watched her city burn, with her face composed, her posture correct. She had learned to cry in private, into pillows, into sleeves, into silence. Here, there was no justification, no bomb, no loss, no cruelty, only food, and the absence of punishment. Her breath broke. She bent forward slightly, one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other clenched against her chest as if holding something in place. Her shoulders began to shake, small at first, then harder rhythm breaking completely. She covered her face. The sound escaped her before she could stop it, a short, sharp inhale followed by something between a sob and a laugh, unfamiliar and uncontrolled. She pressed her palm against her mouth, desperate to contain it. No one shouted. No one stared. No one told her to stop. That was the worst part. The room did not turn toward her. The guards did not step forward. The man behind the counter continued wiping down the serving area, his movements unchanged. She cried. Not quietly, not politely. She cried the way people cry when the structure holding them upright gives way without warning. Tears soaked into the fabric of her sleeve. Her breath hitched, then broke again. She rocked slightly where she sat, caught between the instinct to flee and the inability to stand. She waited for the moment when someone would intervene. It never came. Instead, something else happened. A chair shifted nearby. She felt movement beside her before she saw it, a presence close enough to alter the air. She did not look up. She could not. A folded napkin appeared on the table, placed carefully within reach. Not pushed, not offered with a gesture that demanded acknowledgement. Just set down, white and clean against the wood. She stared at it through blurred vision. Her hands hovered uselessly, unsure of permission, unsure of expectation. Then, without speaking, the woman who had placed it, an American, her uniform crisp, her posture relaxed, rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, not on her arm, not on her shoulder, close enough to be felt, far enough to remain respectful. The hand stayed there for a moment, then it was gone. No words, no instructions, no gaze lingering to measure reaction. She took the napkin. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it to her face, the fabric absorbing tears without dissolving, holding together in a way she did not expect. She breathed into it, grounding herself in the simple physical act of drying her eyes. She did not finish the food. She could not. The plate sat untouched now, the second portion cooling quietly, patient as everything else in this place seemed to be. She pushed it away and sat back exhausted, emptied in a way hunger had never achieved. When she finally stood, her legs felt unsteady as if she had walked a long distance rather than sat at a table. She carried the tray forward with care, her hand still shaking slightly, and set it down where the others had. The man behind the counter nodded once the same way he had the night before. "Take care," he said, already turning away. She walked back to the barracks in a daze, the world sharper and softer at the same time. Sounds reached her with strange clarity. Gravel under boots, wind through bare branches, a train whistle far off in the distance. Inside, she sat on her bunk and stared at the wall. She did not reach for the crumbs in her pocket. For the first time since she had learned the habit, she did not need them. What had undone her was not generosity alone. It was generosity without spectacle, without demand, without humiliation. She had been prepared to endure cruelty. She had not been prepared to be trusted with kindness. And as the afternoon light shifted across the wooden floor, one truth settled into her heavy and undeniable: this country did not need to shout to prove its strength. It simply fed people and let the silence do the rest. Nothing happened. That was the shock. She waited for it through the afternoon, the way one waits for thunder after lightning, certain it must come bracing for the sound that would justify the fear. She moved through work detail with half her attention missing, listening for her name, watching faces for recognition, preparing explanations she would never need. No one called her aside. No guard stopped her. No note appeared beside her bunk. The camp moved on as if the morning had been unremarkable. That unsettled her more than any reprimand could have. She had been trained to expect consequences. Every system she had lived under insisted on them. Action demanded response. Deviation invited correction. Weakness was punished not because it harmed the whole, but because it threatened order. Here, order did not seem to require cruelty. She returned to the barracks that evening with a sense of imbalance, as if gravity had shifted slightly and her body had not yet adjusted. Supper was served at the usual hour. The meal was simple soup bread, something warm and sustaining, and no one mentioned the afternoon. Not the crying, not the seconds, not the kindness. She ate quietly, finishing what was on her plate without ceremony. When she rose to leave, she felt the old habit stir, the reflexive tightening of her fingers, the glance at her pocket, the calculation. Save something. Just in case. She stopped herself. The pause lasted only a second, barely noticeable, but inside it, something loosened. She folded the napkin neatly and left it on the table. The bread remained where it was, crumbs and all. For the first time in years, she did not hide food on her body. The realization came later, after lights out, when she lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling and felt the unfamiliar absence of that small, reassuring weight in her coat. Her pocket lay flat against her side, empty and unguarded. She felt exposed, and strangely safe. Her mind returned uninvited to images she had not thought about since childhood. A kitchen table before the war, wood scarred by years of use, a pot simmering on the stove without anyone measuring how much water had been added to stretch it further, a voice her mother's asking a question so ordinary it had never needed explanation. "Do you want more?" The words carried no judgment. They did not test worth or discipline. They assumed only one thing, that there was enough. She understood now why the phrase had undone her. In Germany, by the end, there was never enough. Not food, not time, not patience. Every request was weighed against scarcity. Every kindness rationed until it lost its shape. Even generosity had become a performance, a thing displayed loudly to mask what was missing underneath. Here, abundance was quiet. It did not announce itself. It did not demand gratitude. It did not need witnesses. She had seen it everywhere since arriving, though she had not known how to name it. In the way the Americans ate without counting. In the way they spoke about food not as survival, but as routine. In the way the camp kitchens ran not frugal, not wasteful, simply confident. This confidence did not come from ignorance. She knew enough now to understand that Americans too were at war. Their sons were overseas. Their ration books existed, though they were thinner than Germany's. Their factories worked around the clock, their fields were planted by those too young or too old to fight. And yet, even in wartime, their tables held enough. She had seen it through the cracks, through stories traded quietly, through glimpses beyond the fence. Victory gardens behind houses. Neat rows of vegetables grown not because hunger demanded it, but because contribution did. Pantries stocked with canned goods, labeled and stacked. Milk delivered in glass bottles collected and reused without ceremony. Abundance without boasting. Strength without spectacle. She began to understand that the kindness she had encountered was not accidental. It was not a trick. It was not even generosity in the way she had been taught to think of generosity, dramatic, visible, transactional. It was structure. The Americans did not feed prisoners well to prove they were good. They fed them well because they could, because their system allowed it, because cruelty was inefficient and humiliation unnecessary. Power here was quiet. She thought again of the moment at the counter, the way the man had filled her plate without comment, without calculation. The way the spoon had dipped and risen as if the act required no moral weight at all. He had not been performing mercy. He had been doing his job. That was the revelation that stayed with her. This country did not need to convince its enemies of its strength. It lived it in its kitchens, in its routines, in the unremarkable certainty that there would be enough tomorrow. She slept better that night than she had since capture. Not deeply, not without dreams, but without the constant vigilance that had become second nature. When she woke, she did not reach immediately for her coat to check what had been saved. The habit had not vanished. Habits never do, but it had loosened its grip. Days passed. Nothing happened. No price emerged. No hidden cost revealed itself. The absence of consequence became its own lesson. She began to watch the Americans differently. Not as captors performing benevolence, but as people operating within a moral framework that did not require fear to function. Guards joked quietly with one another. Cooks argued about seasoning. A woman in uniform corrected a list, then set it aside to help someone carry a crate. No one spoke of ideology. No one spoke of victory. They spoke of dinner, and in that she found the answer she had not known how to ask. A country that could offer abundance without humiliation did not fear softness. It did not confuse kindness with weakness. It did not need to remind anyone who held power. It trusted its strength enough to be humane. That night, as she folded her blanket and lay back against the thin mattress, she felt something settle inside her. Not gratitude, yet not forgiveness, but understanding. The kind that changes how fear works. The kind that makes it harder to hate. The kind that lingers long after the meal is over. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she knew the bell would ring again, and for the first time since the war began, she was not afraid of what it might invite her to receive. She noticed it in the quiet moments. Not during meals, not during roll call, not even during work details where routine dulled thought and fatigue made everything simpler. She noticed it in the spaces between the pauses where nothing was happening, and yet everything was being revealed. America did not shout. There were no banners reminding anyone of strength. No speeches delivered over loudspeakers. No slogans painted on walls to be absorbed through repetition. Power here did not demand attention. It assumed it. That unsettled her at first. In Germany, strength had always been announced. It arrived with flags and music and rigid ceremony with words spoken loudly enough to drown out doubt. Sacrifice was demanded, not negotiated. Hunger was framed as virtue. Obedience was praised as honor. Here, none of that seemed necessary. The Americans were at war, she knew that now. Yet the war rarely intruded into the texture of daily life inside the camp. Guards spoke of brothers overseas, of letters from home, of towns she had never heard of that produced more steel than entire regions of Europe. They spoke without bitterness, without the constant edge of urgency that had shaped every conversation she remembered from Germany's final years. Confidence did that, she realized. Confidence did not need reinforcement. She began to see the contrast everywhere. In the kitchens where food arrived consistently, not as a reward, not as leverage, but as expectation. In the workshops where broken equipment was fixed rather than blamed. In the rhythm of the camp itself, structured but not suffocating, orderly without cruelty. The Americans trusted their systems. Germany had trusted control. That difference had shaped everything. She thought back to home, to factories stripped of workers, to machines standing idle for lack of fuel, to young boys and old men filling roles once held by skilled hands. She remembered how scarcity had tightened its grip until every resource became political, every decision ideological. In America, industry hummed quietly in the background, unromantic and relentless. Trains arrived on schedule. Warehouses were stocked. Tools were replaced when they broke. Nothing was worshipped, everything was used. This was not arrogance. It was scale. She had glimpsed it through the train windows on her journey west, mile after mile of farmland towns spaced generously apart, rail yards that seemed endless. She had not understood then what she was seeing. Now it made sense. America did not shout because it did not need to convince itself. Its strength was structural. The guards did not boast. The cooks did not preen. The officers did not lecture. They simply operated within a system that worked, one that had room for decency, because it was not constantly on the brink of collapse. She wondered when Germany had crossed that line, the moment when control replaced trust, when sacrifice became compulsory rather than chosen. She wondered if it had been inevitable, or if it had been a decision made so gradually that no one noticed until it was too late. These thoughts did not arrive as judgments. They arrived as comparisons. She thought of American families sitting down to dinner at the same hour she ate in the mess hall. Tables worn smooth by years of use. Children asking for seconds without fear of rebuke. Mothers and fathers measuring days not by survival, but by routine. She thought of German kitchens reduced to calculation where every meal was a reminder of limits, every request a negotiation. Neither side had chosen the war, but only one side seemed capable of absorbing its weight without turning inward, without breaking apart. She did not romanticize America. She saw its flaws clearly enough, the segregation whispered about quietly, the tensions she sensed, but did not yet understand the grief carried by men whose sons were fighting far from home. This was not perfection, but it was coherence. And that coherence had allowed something extraordinary mercy without weakness. As the days passed, she became aware of another layer to the contrast, one she could not name directly but felt nonetheless. America's unity was not enforced. It was assumed, challenged at times perhaps, but rooted deeply enough to withstand disagreement. Germany's unity had been demanded. America's had been built. She did not know how long this difference would last. She could not see the future. She could not imagine the country decades from now fractured by arguments she had never heard. Industries hollowed out, trust eroded by voices shouting past one another. But she knew this version of America, the one she was witnessing, had existed. And that mattered. It mattered that a nation once believed so fully in its capacity that it could afford to be generous even toward those it had defeated. It mattered that strength had been expressed not through domination, but through restraint. She wondered sometimes if the Americans around her understood what they had inherited, if they knew how rare this balance was, how easily it could be lost. She wondered if they would recognize its absence should it ever fade. These were not questions she could ask aloud. They belonged to observation, not discussion. At night, lying in her bunk, she listened to the distant sounds of the camp, settling laughter from another barracks, a radio playing somewhere beyond the fence, the steady pulse of a world not constantly bracing for collapse. She did not feel grateful yet. She felt reflective. The kind of reflection that does not seek answers, but frames questions carefully and holds them up to the light. What kind of country feeds its prisoners without spectacle? What kind of power does not need to announce itself? What happens when trust replaces fear? She did not know the answers, but she knew this much. She had seen a version of America that did not need to shout, and that quiet strength echoed louder than any slogan she had ever been taught to believe. Years later, when the war was over and the borders had shifted again, she returned to a country that no longer resembled the one she had left. Germany was quieter than she remembered. Not peaceful, just exhausted. Cities rebuilt themselves unevenly, stone by stone, memory by memory. Streets bore new names. Old slogans disappeared, replaced by an awkward silence that no one quite knew how to fill. People worked, ate, married, buried their dead, and rarely spoke about what they had endured unless asked directly. She did not talk about America, not at first. She married. She raised children. She learned how to live in a world that asked her to look forward rather than backward. The war became something discussed in careful terms, stripped of detail, softened by time. But the memory stayed. It stayed in the smallest places, in kitchens, in the way she prepared meals without counting slices too precisely, in the way she asked her children, casually, almost unconsciously, "Do you want more?" and waited for the answer without judgment. In the way she never scolded anyone for eating too slowly, or too much, or too eagerly. Food to her was never a test again. It was an offering. Sometimes, late at night, she would catch herself holding a spoon too tightly, feeling its weight, grounding herself in its solidity. American spoons had been heavier. She remembered that clearly. She remembered the napkin too white thick, placed beside her without ceremony. She never forgot how that had felt. not the crying, the absence of punishment. That was what stayed. Years turned into decades. Her children grew and left. The world argued, rebuilt, argued again. America changed too. She knew that from the newspapers, from the voices on the radio, from the way people spoke about it with less certainty than before. But the America she carried was not the one from headlines. It was the America of a mess hall. At dusk, of a man behind a counter who did not look up when he offered seconds of a woman in uniform who placed a napkin without asking for thanks. When she grew older, her grandchildren began to ask questions. They asked about the war cautiously, respectfully, the way children do when they sense that something fragile lies beneath the answer. They asked what it had been like to be captured, to be taken so far from home, to live among enemies. She told them many things. She told them about fear, about hunger, about long nights when hope felt irresponsible. And sometimes when the room was quiet and the question was asked just right, she told them about a meal. She described the floor clean and wooden, the lights that did not flicker, the smell of meat and coffee. She described how she had asked a question she did not know how to ask, and how the answer had not come in words. Her grandchildren listened. Years later, some of them would travel. Some would study history. Some would read letters and documents and wonder how wars were actually survived, not just fought. A few of them would write, not to governments, not to institutions, but to strangers. They wrote to American families whose names they found in old records, to towns near the camps, to historical societies that preserved memories others had forgotten. Their letters were simple, unadorned, careful not to overstate. They said, "Thank you. Thank you for feeding her. Thank you for not humiliating her. Thank you for showing her a kind of strength she had never known existed." They did not ask for absolution. They did not ask for recognition. They offered gratitude, late imperfect but sincere. Some Americans read those letters and felt a quiet, unfamiliar pride. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demands agreement. The kind that settles gently in the chest and stays. The pride of knowing that once their country had chosen decency not because it was watched, but because it was capable. The pride of knowing that their grandparents' America had understood something easily forgotten, that power does not diminish when it is shared, and that mercy does not weaken a nation that is already strong. She lived long enough to see the world argue again about strength, about enemies, about fear. She listened sometimes and wondered if the lesson would survive another generation, but she never doubted what she had experienced. She never forgot the moment when fear had loosened its grip not through force, not through persuasion, but through an offer made without spectacle. When she died, there was nothing extraordinary among her belongings. No medals, no declarations, just ordinary objects worn smooth by years of use. Among them a folded napkin, yellowed with age, kept not as a relic of war but as a reminder of peace. Because America had not defeated her with weapons. It had defeated her fear with seconds.